Hello, everyone. Steve Parr here, Director of the Gwinnett Metro Baptist Network. We're so glad that you're joining us on this webinar. I've got my good friend Steve Foster from the Georgia Baptist Mission Board. Steve and I go way back. We have served together in ministry. This man loves evangelism. He has pastored churches, been interim pastor in churches. He served as a vocational evangelist. And this guy just loves and knows all things evangelism. I'm excited about what he's getting to present today. I've actually had a role in it he'll share a little bit about. It's not the reason for doing this. Actually, he initiated this, but I certainly wanted him to be a part of your lives to help you do a great job with evangelism. So there's something called the Domino Effect we're going to talk about. But Steve, first I want to say welcome. Glad to have you with us today, my brother.
Good to be here, Steve.
We'll talk about the Domino Effect. Tell us some background. How did it all get started, the Domino Effect?
It came from some research that you led. The research looked at different churches, and this is very important. It looked at churches of all sizes. So if your church runs 30, it looked at the churches that average 30 that baptized more, that were more evangelistic. Or if your church ran all the way up to 5,000 or 6,000, the size didn't matter. What mattered is your size church. Is it more evangelistic than other churches your size? And when you did the research, there were 6 principles that kept reappearing in these churches. And the original diagram that I used to use had baptism at the center because, when people accept the Lord, that's the first step of obedience as a Christian. So baptism was at the center in these 6 principles. We rewrote those principles and called it the Domino Effect. And so you'll hear me talk about 7 dominoes. And the reason there's 7 now, we thought baptism was so important that we thought let that be a standalone domino. So
that's great. And Steve, man, I'm excited that it's been taken and expanded. And that was an important part of the research. Instead of looking at larger churches that were baptizing, sometimes larger churches, the ratio may not be as strong as a smaller church who's baptizing maybe not as many people, but as a ratio to the worship and so forth, it does make a difference. So that was exciting. And you call it the Domino Effect. That's the name you guys came up with. I'm fine with that. I called it originally the Net Effect. And you may recall the book I wrote, Coffee Shop That Changed Church. It's based on those original 6. But y'all built on that. And so let's talk about some of those and how we can help pastors utilize these to help their churches to be more effective evangelistically. But let me ask this question before I do. With COVID-19, and depending on when you're watching this, I don't know where we're at in that process now, but right now it's a serious issue. To what degree has that been affecting, or does it affect, the domino effect and the possibilities in evangelism?
COVID does affect some of the things that we traditionally do in evangelism. I'll make a couple statements about it. First, COVID's not going to last forever. So what I tell churches is, if you feel like you have a weakness in evangelism, then now's a good time to begin to prepare once COVID is over with, as far as for the most part when it's over with. Are we going to be prepared to engage in evangelism? In fact, I had a 2-hour meeting yesterday with a pastor in your association, Steve, that felt like before COVID, they were really gaining momentum in evangelism. And COVID shut some of that down, but he wanted to meet because he said, I want to make sure that we are beginning to lay the foundation as COVID, gets behind us, that we'll be ready to step in the community again. And it's very similar to a lot of churches that I've seen who have said, when we had to go to online services, we thought that'd be a great time to lay new carpet down or repaint small group rooms since no one was there. I think there's principles here that even if you can't use like this week or next week, COVID's not going to be around forever. And so if you feel like, hey, we've kind of been weak in the area of evangelism, I think now would be a good time to begin to lay down some principles among your leadership that when COVID is behind us, you can begin to really impact the neighborhoods that you live in.
Very good. Well, I know right now you're not going to teach the whole thing. We're just taking an introduction, but give us kind of a preview of why it's called the Domino Effect and how it works and what it's about. And we'll talk about in a few moments how pastors could engage with that and apply it in their churches.
And as far as the Domino Effect, you would probably think when you first hear it, it's like lining up 7 dominoes and knocking over one. And it's really not that. It's just there's 7 dominoes, and as you go through the training, you don't try to do all 7. You don't even try to do all 2. You just pick the domino that you feel like this is the domino that best fits where we are as a church. We need to be working on these. And the genius of this is that it's not per se a one-time training that you just put on the shelf. It's teaching you how to change the evangelistic culture in your church. What we've learned is you can, and every pastor who listens to this will probably have the same experience. I know when I was on staff, this happened. Sometimes you'll go and hear great training, and you'll come back to your church so excited, and you'll share that training. But I have to admit, sometimes 3 months later, it didn't change my church. And the reason is, unless you change the culture of the church, in this case, the evangelistic culture, sometimes people attend training and they tell you that was awesome, but it doesn't change them. And so the 7 dominoes is an attempt to constantly work on an aspect of evangelism in your church that should change the evangelistic culture. And if the culture gets changed, you gain momentum. And when you gain momentum, it's really your best friend in church work. When momentum builds, what seemed to be hard before the momentum becomes a whole lot easier in reaching people.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, from my experience, Steve, and you can comment on this, I've always observed evangelistic churches, those who are reaching people, are led by evangelistic pastors. And that may scare some pastors first, but when I say evangelistic, I'm not saying you've got a gift of evangelism, although some do. I'm saying that whether you've got that gift or not, you highlight and elevate evangelism. And I've often talked about the fact that whatever a pastor elevates is that to which the members gravitate. So it's not a matter of having a gift for evangelism, but more elevating evangelism. And in my experience, Steve, I've never seen a church excel in evangelism where the pastor was not engaged. How about you?
It all rises and falls on the leader. And I hate to say it sometimes, because as a leader, when I hear that, sometimes I feel like, gosh, I have a responsibility. But we do. We have to set the example. And what we talk about and what we model is what people notice in the congregation, and it begins to catch. And there's the old saying, evangelism is caught as much as it's taught. And of course, the truth is both. You have to teach it and model it. But if you teach it and they don't see it in the leader, especially the pastor, they don't see it exhibited in your life, then I don't think you'll lead the church to be evangelistic. So
that's true. And let me just talk about for a second and talk about the dominoes. Which one of those would be the most obvious to anybody would know, and which one maybe not be quite as obvious? Now, the great thing about this, as you said, it's not a matter of all 7, although if you can add all 7, you're really going to be really knocking it out. But it's customizable in terms of, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But what is one of those dominoes that's probably more obvious, but even the obvious thing, you've got to elevate it and improve on it? And maybe what's one that's not so obvious that maybe pastors are missing out on? What do you think?
Probably the most obvious is the domino of personal evangelism, meaning this. When you think about evangelism, we normally think about training our people in personal evangelism. So that's probably the thing that comes to the mind of most leaders. The thing that's probably not as obvious, and it's the first domino, and it may be the most important because I think it lays such a foundation. It's the domino of prayer, that we pray for lost people by name. And when I teach this, I tell pastors and church leaders, if I didn't know much about church, I mean, I knew what church was kind of about, but I didn't go and never was a member and wasn't a Christian. If you asked me, do you think that church down the street, do you think they pray? I would say, well, yeah, I'm sure they pray. Then if you said, do you think they pray for lost people? I would say, obviously, they would pray for lost people. But the truth is, most of us, if we walked into our next Bible study and started with prayer, and we asked, are there any prayer requests? Most of us know what we're going to hear. We're going to hear physical requests. We're going to hear so-and-so is going to have a knee replacement and so on. And we should pray for those people. We might hear a prayer request about someone needing a job and so on. You probably won't hear in most churches a prayer that says, pray for Joe. He works at Starbucks. I met him yesterday and had a gospel conversation. He's lost, but prayed the seeds I planted really takes effect.
Yeah.
Those are rare. And so the domino of prayer, which is the first domino, is simply looking for ways to lead your people to pray for lost people by name. And I do want to say this. When I say by name, in some churches, you might could say first and last name. In some churches, it may be just better to say the first name. I actually had a conversation this morning with a pastor about 2 hours from here, and he's walking his church through this. He's a new pastor. He came in November, young pastor, and he realizes it's going to take time to change the culture in that church. But he made a statement. He said, I started with the domino of prayer because I felt like it's what we needed. And he said, I'm having trouble as I lead my people, because they'll in the prayer time say, I have an unspoken. He said, some of them I know that they're praying for a lost person. And I told him, I said, because he's in a small community, I said, I get it. Because sometimes if you say, pray for Joe at the hardware store, everybody in there knows who Joe is. And that could be awkward, like, well, you're saying Joe's lost, which he is. And I said, you might just want to tell them to do one or two things, to say, I've got a person, his initials J. Or I said, even if that's too obvious, you might just say, I have an unspoken, I can't mention the name, but it's a lost person. That way, at least the class or small group understands that we're praying for lost people.
Well, I want our pastors, as they're listening to this, to think back to something you said originally. This was not a guess about what works in evangelism. We actually studied churches that were most effective, and we found common denominators. They were doing these things, and the more they were doing, the more powerful it was. So pastors, you need to know not just about prayer and personal evangelism, but what are these other five? You say, well, how can I find out? We're going to tell you how. We want to give you an opportunity to initiate a group in your church where you invite 3 or 4 pastors. Steve and I will help you with that. But Steve, talk about this for a moment. How would we go from here to get this information to the hands, not just pastors, but maybe pastors and some of their key leaders? What would we do?
We have an intentional approach where there was a time in my evangelism teaching where when we taught something, if we could have 50 people there or a bigger event, if we had 100 people there, and I'm talking for training, that was kind of the sign of success. And what we've done is we've come back and said, small is probably better, because when we teach this, we want a small group because there's discussion. And if you get, my experience is, if I'm teaching it, if there's more than 8 pastors, it's a little too many. 5 is a good group. But I do this all the time. There's a couple of pastors. So the best thing to do is, if a pastor said, hey, I'd be interested, if he'd be willing to maybe host it at his church, which again is a small thing because we're only talking about 4 or 5 people, just a small group, a Sunday school class or a small groups class, then if he would schedule it with me, and if he's got 3 or 4 buddies in the area, he can invite them. If he says, I need some help, then you and I, Steve, could work together and get 3 or 4 pastors there. So that's the approach to it. And while I'm on it, I'll say this. Whenever I teach this, it's a 90-minute teaching because it's discussion time too. Whenever I teach this, and I'm going to say this, I've said this everywhere I go, and not because I'm not saying it here just because you were so heavily involved in creating it. This is the best teaching I've ever done. I teach personal evangelism. There's other things I teach that I love, but I believe this is the best evangelism teaching I've ever been part of, because it seeks to change the culture. It's not just knowledge, it's seeking to change the culture. So at the end of the training, we pass out a little card so the pastors can tell us what church they're from and so on. But there's a question on there. One question says, would you be interested in being part of a mentoring group? And the other question is, would you have any interest in being a facilitator? And what that is this. When the teaching is over, I tell the group, I say this every time I teach, what I just taught is not the best thing you can do. The best thing you can do is get involved with 4 or 5 other pastors. There's a guy who will raise up, who'll be a facilitator. He'll have what we call a coaching manual, and you'll have like 7 meetings. You could meet every month. Most guys meet every 6 or 7 weeks for just 1 hour. And so you would take, for example, the Domino of Prayer, that'd be your first meeting. And for an hour, the facilitator, and he's not really teaching, he's facilitating it, you would discuss how the Domino of Prayer, praying for lost people by name, how that would look in your church. And so, and the great thing about it is when you meet back 5, 6 weeks later, that's the first thing you'll talk about. Hey, did anybody try or do anything with the Domino of Prayer? And then you might have somebody, and even 3 months into it, you might have someone say at the opening of a meeting, they may say, hey, could we go back to the Domino of Prayer because I'm hitting some obstacles in this. And so we're finding from guys I'm talking to, we're finding people who are saying it's encouraging. And that's one of the things we tell the facilitator, no one should ever leave the mentoring group with their head down. It's not,
right.
It's a time of encouragement. In my opinion, there's no experts on evangelism. Nobody has arrived. We're all pilgrims on this spiritual journey trying to do Jesus. And but the fellowship, the encouragement, and really the accountability. I don't know about you. I know I should witness, and I know the Great Commission, but when I'm part of a group and I know that we're going to be talking about it, it really kind of puts a spotlight on my life for me to model this, for me to be the witness I should be.
Okay, well, let me see if I can summarize this, Steve. Let's wrap this up here. First of all, there is no cost involved, right? It's just time.
Yes.
So guys, listen, pastors, this is a no-brainer. Steve's offering to you. So if you're interested, Steve's going to tell you in a moment how to contact him, or you can contact me and I'll get you in touch with him. And then he will be glad to come to your church just to meet with you in a small group one time and talk about the domino effect. And out of that, maybe you want to take it a deeper dive for your meeting, maybe for several weeks. He'd love to do that. That's up to you. You can work with Steve on that. But guys, please take advantage of this. And Steve, how would they get in contact with you if they want to have you come and have a one session or maybe extended sessions, which would be their option? What would be the contact information?
And I will say that they can feel free to contact you because we talk so much.
Sure.
That's a problem to go through you. If they want to reach out to me, an email is probably the best thing. And it would just be my first initial, Foster, Foster, at gabaptist.org.
Very good. And you probably know my pastors at steve@gmba.org. So either one of us will help facilitate that. We'd love to. And I'm excited about the possibilities. Again, I hope all of you who are watching this will do this. I'll add this last thing, gentlemen. If you're a Gwinnett Metro pastor, you've never read the book that I wrote called Coffee Shop That Changed the Church, which actually is based on some of these principles, not all of them, 6 of the 7. I would love to give you a copy complimentary. All I got to do is ask for it. So if you will email me or call me or text me, I'll get you a copy as soon as possible for being a part of this network. A gift from me, actually, not the association, me personally. I'd love to share that with you. Steve, thank you for being with me today. And pastors, don't pass this up. What a great opportunity, again, to help your church move forward in sharing the gospel and seeing people come to know faith in Christ. And I want to say this. I want our churches to thrive and be missionally engaged. That's our vision. And to thrive means to be healthy and growing, and by growing, reaching the lost. So let us help you do that. God bless you. Steve, thanks for being with us today, brother. I appreciate it.
Appreciate you, Steve, and all that you're doing in the network.
All right. You take care. God bless.
Bye.